Test du floor pour UNTV, test 1, 2, 1, 2, test du floor, on vous fait l'anglais.
Test canal anglais 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Canal numéro 2, c'est bon pour UNTV, vous me confirmez? Test en 2. Je vais basculer au canal français.
إعلان مهم 重要提示
Important announcement.
إعلان مهم 重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Anuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة. 为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для того, чтобы устный перевод был полным и качественным, необходимо выступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Shall we?
Ready when you are.
Okay. Good morning. I hope everybody has had a good morning and a good evening rest. Excellencies, distinguished participants, I hereby declare open the fourth meeting of the 61st session of the Human Rights Council. Excellencies, distinguished participants, we will now begin the high-level panel discussion on the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action held pursuant to Council Resolution 60/16. Following information received from the Secretary General on accessibility services for the 61st session, this panel discussion, as with the panel yesterday, is accessible through international sign interpretation and real-time captioning, together with other measures. As reflected in the letter I received from the Chef de Cabinet of the Secretary General, which has been uploaded to the extranet, the provision of mandated accessibility services for panel discussions and for the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities is guaranteed for this session. It is my honor to welcome to the podium Ms. Nada Al-Nashif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, who will deliver an opening statement. It is also my honor to welcome our distinguished panelists, Mr. Martin Chungong, Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, Ms. Beatriz Carrillo de los Reyes, Director General for Equal Treatment and Non-Discrimination and Against Racism at the Ministry of Equality of Spain, His Excellency Mr. James Ndirangu Waweru, Chair-Rapporteur of the Intergovernmental Working Group on the Effective Implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, and Ms. Ketty Marcelo Lopez, President of the Organization of Ashaninka Indigenous Women of the Central Amazon region of Peru. Excellencies, distinguished participants, the list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I encourage all speakers to intervene in an interactive way, present comments, and ask questions that reflect the panelists' intervention and the discussion. The speaking time limit is 1 minute and 30 seconds for all, and a maximum of 40 speakers will be accommodated. Delegates inscribed on the list of speakers who cannot take the floor because of time constraints can upload their statement on the online system to be posted on the extranet. I now have the honor to invite the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights to deliver her opening statement. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates. The Durban Declaration and Programme of Action is a global blueprint for racial justice and equality. 25 years ago, it laid the foundation for much of today's international work against racial discrimination. It outlined wide-ranging measures to end racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. It highlighted enslavement and colonialism as root causes of racism and looked ahead to global challenges, including widening inequalities and online hate. Today, we pay tribute to those who led the negotiation and the adoption of this landmark document. Civil society, particularly organizations led by people who experienced racism, played a central role. In the past 25 years, there has indeed been substantial progress towards addressing racism. The adoption or amendment of laws that prohibit racial discrimination, the adoption of national or regional policies, strategies, and action plans, the establishment of equality bodies, and the adoption of a second decade on people of African descent. And yet, racism continues to poison communities, politics, media, sport, the online world, and much more, and no country can claim to be free of it. Recent years have witnessed a resurgence of racist speech and actions, sometimes from the highest levels of government. Racist tropes rooted in white supremacy and harmful stereotypes are becoming normalized, including on social media. And some governments have taken actual steps to reverse anti-racist policies and initiatives. Many conflicts around the world are fueled by long-standing discrimination, dehumanization, and deepening inequality. Particularly severe forms of racial discrimination are at the heart of the protracted crises in Myanmar, in the occupied Palestinian territory, and Sudan, among others. Distinguished delegates, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism are surging around the world, while black migrants face pervasive forms of racism amid widespread anti-migrant vitriol. New data from 137 countries last year showed that the most common form of discrimination is based on national or ethnic group, while discrimination on the basis of skin color remains prevalent. According to our own data, at least 30% of human rights defenders killed around the world in 2024 were indigenous or from a minority group. In European countries, black people, Roma, and people from different ethnic backgrounds continue to face racist harassment and racial discrimination, along with people targeted on account of their religious belief. At the global level, economic relations are shaped by power imbalances that reflect centuries of colonialism and exploitation. These inequalities affected and continue to affect global finance, trade, and governance institutions. They do not reflect market efficiency, but rather policy decisions and frameworks that are in need of reform. Distinguished delegates, one of the lasting legacies of the DDPA and of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination is the knowledge that racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance are not inevitable. They can be dismantled, but they require decisive leaders who take action at the individual, societal, institutional, and systemic levels, and by states and others that confront legacies of enslavement and colonialism and deliver reparatory justice. It requires strength and courage to shift stereotypes, challenge centuries of discrimination, dismantle power structures, and change behavior. In this regard, we need determined collective action. The simple way forward is for states to implement their commitments under the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action. This requires comprehensive reforms and responses and well-resourced national and regional action plans. It also requires data collection and disaggregation and independent monitoring by strong institutions. It requires educational reform and the participation of racial and ethnic groups in decision-making processes. And it requires accountability, access to justice, support for victims, and ways to repair the harm that was done, sometimes over generations. Businesses also have an important role. They have a responsibility to prevent and mitigate racial discrimination linked to their operations through policies, due diligence, and mechanisms to address grievances. They also play a key role at the community level by creating jobs and stimulating economic development. Media outlets have a specific role in promoting and reflecting diversity and fair representation, including in their coverage of culture and sports. And civil society organizations continue to be pivotal in pressing for systemic reform, identifying discrimination, advocating for justice, and driving policy change. And I'm sure we'll hear more about the role of parliaments. But as civic space contracts, people and organizations that stand against racism are coming under increasing threat. Peaceful protesters on the streets, mothers fighting for justice for the deaths of their children and relatives, organizations working against hate and defending migrants' rights. We need to have each other's backs. Working in solidarity across equality movements amplifies our power and accelerates change. Real transformative action requires sustained and predictable funding, public recognition, and support for these organizations. And our office provides guidance and technical expertise on anti-discrimination legislation, supports national action plans and strategies, data collection, education tools, and more that really encapsulate all the experience that we have in this area. We urge everyone to make full use of all of these. Distinguished delegates, recent years have seen the loss of influential voices in the global struggle for civil rights and racial justice. Towering figures such as Desmond Tutu in South Africa, Marielle Franco in Brazil, and pioneers like Claudette Colvin and Jesse Jackson in the United States have shaped movements that transcended borders and inspired generations. Their legacies remind us that the pursuit of equality is shared across societies and rooted in many histories and diverse experiences. As we honor their memory, we must continue to find inspiration in their example. The UN Human Rights Office stands today and always with all who confront racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance every day, everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy High Commissioner. I will now give the floor to the distinguished panelists for their initial presentations. I have the honor to give the floor now to Mr. Martin Chungong. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Madam Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, distinguished panelists here on the podium, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be part of this conversation this morning. And indeed, I want to thank the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for inviting me on behalf of the IPU to join this conversation. I was asked during the preparations for this meeting to give you some initial reflections, personal reflections on the topic that we are addressing today, discrimination and racism. And I thought really hard. I asked myself, what can I say from my own personal experience? And then it occurred to me that over the years as Secretary General, head of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, when I do travel, people ask me, my interlocutors ask me in private, so where do you originally come from? Or they will say, oh, we hear you are the first African and non-European to be Secretary General of the IPU. How do you feel about that? I do not say that this is overt racism or discrimination, but I do feel that the two are never far beneath the surface. And so it gives me a pleasure today to reiterate the relevance of the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action that we are discussing today. And when I reflect on this, I realize that it was never intended as a time-bound response to a passing challenge. I think you've said it, Madam High Commissioner. Its relevance today is undeniable. Around the world, we are experiencing a resurgence of nativist rhetoric, persistent racial inequalities, the amplification of hate speech online, and growing mistrust between communities. The manifestations may evolve, but the underlying challenge remains. The DDPA explicitly recognizes the role of parliaments and the Inter-Parliamentary Union, and you asked me, Madam High Commissioner, to talk about the role of parliaments, and let me use this opportunity to highlight a few of those roles that accrue to parliaments and which are relevant to the declaration. One, parliaments pass legislation. They transform international commitments into binding national law. This includes enacting comprehensive anti-discrimination frameworks, criminalizing incitement to racial hatred, and addressing structural inequalities in education, employment, and access to justice. Yet, many parliamentarians encounter resistance when challenging entrenched interests and discriminatory narratives. Just this month, I had the pleasure of launching a new IPU study on violence against politicians, and we were amazed and overwhelmed to discover that more than 71% of MPs and politicians around the world reported having been victims of violence in one way or the other, online and offline. And so this is attributed to the fact that they address issues that are sensitive, such as racism and discrimination, and they're victimized on that account. And so we think that we need to move from rhetoric to political courage. You did say that fighting discrimination requires strong political courage, Madam Deputy High Commissioner. Second, I want to mention oversight. Parliaments have the role to oversight government, whole government, accountable for the implementation of international commitments such as the Durban Declaration. And we are very keen for parliaments to exercise these powers, including ensuring that human rights institutions are properly resourced in the different countries. Then we have representation. Inclusive institutions strengthen public trust, and when parliaments reflect the diversity of the societies they represent or they serve across race, ethnicity, religion, gender, and age, they are better positioned to craft responsive and legitimate policies. Then I think parliaments have a strong role to play when it comes to leadership in public discourse. Parliaments shape national narratives at a time when racism and xenophobia can spread virally online. Elected officials have a particular responsibility to reject incitement, model respectful and fact-based debate, and show solidarity with those targeted by intimidation or stigma. We do not have at the IPU a standalone program on Durban, the Durban process, but combating discrimination is embedded in the DNA of the organization and its current strategy. We work through our Committee on the Human Rights of Parliamentarians. We have capacity building initiatives, and we develop policy guidance that serve to support parliaments in addressing racism and related intolerance in practical and concrete ways. Credibility begins at home, and leading by example is integral to our commitment to the values we promote. That is why the IPU's current strategy lays strong emphasis on representation and inclusive parliaments, including for groups that have historically been marginalized. Excellencies, let me conclude by pointing out that the DDPA reminds us, and the Deputy High Commissioner also reiterated that, combating racism requires coordinated efforts. It's not something to be left in the hands of one constituency alone. So governments, parliaments, civil society, the private sector, international organizations are all and should be involved. And parliaments play a key role in that galaxy and that ecosystem of stakeholders. I thank you, Mr. President, members of the Human Rights Council, for this opportunity. I just want to reassure you that the IPU, the Global Organization of Parliaments, stands ready to continue to work with the Human Rights Council and other human rights advocates and stakeholders in upholding the provisions of the Durban Declaration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to Ms. Beatriz Carrillo de los Reyes. Madam, you have the floor.
Good morning, Mr. President, High Commissioner, authorities, excellencies, dear colleagues, one and all. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude for your invitation to participate in this panel representing the government of Spain. For me, as a person in charge of equal treatment policies and policies to combat racism, to be present here has a great deal of meaning. Not just because of the institutional importance of this forum and the multilateral human rights system, but because of the significant moment in history in which this event is taking place. 25 years after Durban, that is. The world, as we all know, is going through a complicated time of deep tension. There is more and more political polarization. Exclusive, identity-based speech continues to gain ground in public debate. Hate speech finds new ways of gaining ground through digital means. And misinformation and bullies continue to erode coexistence and the most basic consensus and agreements. And in far too many cases, diversity is now seen as a threat. We are not confronted to isolated phenomena. This is a global struggle over the societal model that we want to defend and uphold. Durban came about at a time at which the international community understood that racism was not a single problem on the fringe. It understood that it was a structural problem that affects all countries. To combat it meant more than moral condemnations. It called for public policies, cooperation among states, the participation of civil society, and political will sustained throughout time. Today we still have that same roadmap, as current today as it ever was, because contemporary racism is not merely seen explicitly. It is seen in persistent types of unequal access to housing, to employment, to justice, to education. And it is also seen in the overrepresentation of certain communities in situations of poverty and inequality. And particularly, it becomes seeped into the algorithms that double historic biases, and that will continue unless we have sufficient regulation. And on top of all of this, it has new forms that we must acknowledge, such as discrimination against people of African descent, against Roma people, against Arab, Muslim, indigenous peoples, and the list goes on top of institutional racism and the multiple types of exclusion that women of color continue to experience. The question is not whether Durban is still relevant today. The relevant question is whether we are enforcing it and whether we are doing enough. We, in Spain, and please bear with me as I tell you what we are doing, we have learned that the fight against racism has an effect when it becomes part of the institutional architecture, which is why we have approved very strong laws, such as the Law on Equal Treatment and Non-Discrimination, which includes the inversion of the burden of proof and recognizes the principle of reparation, offering stronger legal guarantees. We have created mechanisms for equal treatment in order to strengthen the institutional capability of oversight and legal support and assistance. And now we have bodies such as CEDRE, which is the Council for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and Ethnic Discrimination. CEDRE has several offices across the Spanish territory, and we work in cooperation with ministries, institutions, with the different municipalities and civil society, because fighting racism cannot depend on political trends or individual wills. It needs structure. It needs investment. It needs support. Support coming by all people, all institutions, all stakeholders in society. We know that the progress we have made is not irreversible. In Europe and in some parts of the world, we are witnessing how extreme right political powers are using fear as a political weapon We witness how certain types of speech are being repeated by the youth. We see how hatred is normalized online. And even through our screens in our pockets, we see how elsewhere in the world, small children are being held and separated from their parents, how people can break into someone's home, take the parents, leave the children behind, and put the parents into prison. This is not just a national phenomenon, it's transnational. Why? Which is why defending Durban is defending multilateralism. It is defending the idea that human rights are not a concession with nothing, that it is an agreement among countries, a universal standard accepted by human rights. It is to assert that human dignity is non-negotiable. It is to believe that dignity strengthens rather than weakens our democracy. And if I may, I would like to add a personal note here. I am a Roma woman. I belong to a very large group that has survived centuries of persecution and attempted extermination. To be able to take the floor here today as a representative of a government is proof that institutions, when they do work, when they are democratic, can create opportunities of true equality. But it is not enough. We cannot be mere exceptions in spheres of power and participation. But this opportunity doesn't just happen spontaneously. It is the result of public policies, of historic memory, of inclusive education, and of strong legal frameworks. There can be no racial justice without memory. There can be no social cohesion without the effective participation of those who are involved in it. There can be no equality without resources. Durban gives us that clear framework. Cooperation at many levels, transformative education, effective access to justice, trustworthy data, support for victims, and real participation of the affected communities. Our job is to take that framework and turn it into tangible results. Results that we can feel with our very own hands. Today, the world is facing many crises, geopolitical ones, economic and climate crises. Against that backdrop, one might be tempted to relegate the anti-racism agenda to the back burner. That would be a very serious strategic mistake, because racism is not a sectoral problem. It is a factor of social destabilization. It is important for social cohesion. It is an obstacle for the development of peoples and the development of our planet. To improve anti-racist policies does not erode our societies. Rather, it makes them stronger, more resilient. 25 years since Durban, the challenge now is not to redefine the problem. It is rather to renew the political agenda, to face it again much stronger still. We need international cooperation. We need more investment in education with a memory, with remembering the oppressed peoples. We need to improve the legal protection mechanisms, the accountability in digital platforms, and to support this commitment beyond the electoral cycles. History has already showed us what happens when dehumanization becomes normal. We need look no further than just 80 years ago, how it all started and where we ended up. But it has also shown us that institutions, when they are backed by political will, can change the reality. And I will wrap up on this. Durban is not a historical document. It is our current compass. To defend it today is to defend the type of world that we want to pass on to future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. James Ndirangu Waweru. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. President, It is an honor to address this high-level panel marking the International Day for Elimination of Racial Discrimination and commemorating the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Work, the DDPA. I do this in my capacity as Chair-Rapporteur of the Intergovernmental Working Group on the effective implementation of the DDPA, one of the central mechanisms established to follow up on the commitments made in Durban in 2001 and as a part of the wider UN anti-racism human rights architecture. 25 years on, the DDPA remains the most comprehensive global framework for combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Its breadth and scope continue to guide our collective understanding of racism as a structural, historical, and contemporary phenomenon, rooted in legacies of slavery, the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and systemic exclusion, and unfortunately persistent in modern institutions, digital spaces, and socioeconomic inequalities. And it recognizes that racism manifests at the individual, community, and systemic levels, cutting across and also reinforced by other grounds of discrimination such as sex, gender, social, economic, health, and migration status. We must acknowledge the foresight and the depth of the DDPA. Durban drew an unbroken link between the past and the present, between slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, and the enduring consequences of those atrocities today. It recognized that confronting these legacies requires not only acknowledgement, but also halting and reversing their lasting consequences and addressing global structural inequalities importantly. The DDPA recognized, for the first time at a global level, people of African descent as a distinct group and outlined specific measures needed to realize their rights. It also called for multi-stakeholder action at all levels, engaging not only states, but also international financial institutions, the private sector, and even sports institutions, recognizing that dismantling systemic racism requires coordinated commitment across all sectors of society. Mr. President, as we commemorate the adoption of the DDPA, we need to ask ourselves some pertinent questions. What, if evaluated, will be the grade of our fidelity to the provisions and aspirations of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action? What steps can we take to ensure that different actors across the spectrum collaborate effectively to accelerate progress and build the required momentum for the full implementation of the DDPA? Reflecting on these lessons learned, the UN anti-racism human rights mechanisms have highlighted progress since 2001. Public awareness has grown. There have been advances recognizing towards historical injustices. Efforts to strengthen the human rights framework on racial discrimination are underway, with progress being made in the development of the draft UN Declaration on the Rights of People of African Descent, and discussions on the elaboration of complementary standards to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination continuing. However, this is not enough. Racial discrimination continues to be manifest in education, employment, health, housing, law enforcement and criminal justice systems, and now also in digital and algorithmic environments which reproduce long-standing biases. Calls for reparatory justice and structural reforms as essential components for meaningful transformation are growing. Looking forward, accelerating the implementation of the DDPA must be understood to be an absolute imperative to stem rising inequalities within and between countries, and to prevent disunity and conflict, and achieving its goals requiring renewed collaboration amongst all actors, states, UN entities, and mechanisms. Combating racism is a collective and shared responsibility. Galvanizing political support against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance requires a multi-layered, holistic approach. The DDPA provides precisely this through a clear, practical roadmap. The onus then primarily lies with the state, which has the duty to act and enable actions by others, such as robust laws, strategies, and action plans against racial discrimination, strong national human rights institutions, and equality bodies. Mr. President, what we need today is stronger measures, greater implementation, and more resources, broader support. The links to the key element of the DDPA, solidarity. Durban has taught us that confronting racism is not merely a national obligation, but a shared international responsibility. Both national and transnational solidarity are essential, especially as the challenges we face increasingly require coordinated, multilateral responses and unity amongst all of us who are committed to fighting racism and inequality. This is what will enable us to translate commitments into tangible and lasting change. As chair of the Intergovernmental Working Group, I reaffirm our mandate grounded in the DDPA remains crucial. The DDPA, as has been said, is a living document, guiding us through the present and shaping our collective future and the world that we hope to leave to future generations. Implementing it fully means renewing our political will, strengthening our multilateral commitments, and ensuring that every measure we take advances dignity, equality, and justice for all. In closing, let the 25th anniversary of Durban not just be a moment of commemoration alone, but a moment of recommitment and decisive action towards a world where equality is a lived reality for all. The path ahead will not be easy, but it is one we must walk together. I thank you.
Thank you. I have the honor now to give the floor to Ms. Ketty Marcelo Lopez. Madam, you have the floor.
Buenos días.
Good morning to all. We extend our greetings to you all, and we thank the Human Rights Council for inviting living voices to this panel. 25 years on from Durban, the thoughts and the feelings of Latin America's indigenous women continue to see discrimination. We've seen 25 years since the Durban Programme of Action was adopted, 25 years since the international community recognized that racism and structural discrimination were open wounds in the history of humanity. And for us, the indigenous peoples and women of Peru and Latin America, Durban was not a symbolic act, but a response to the tireless struggle that started with our ancestors to seek respect for our equal dignity. In 2001, there was progress in international law with the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. But our collective rights continue to be violated. Racism has not gone. Structural discrimination is not dismantled when states like Peru reproduce the colonial heritage in their economic policy, promoting seizure of indigenous territories for extraction, criminalization of indigenous leaders who defend those lands which guarantee our lives. Latin America is the region where we see the most killings of indigenous leaders defending their lands. A lack of access to basic services such as intercultural health and bilingual education, and for indigenous women, the debt is still higher. Indigenous women have defended their lands, transmitted our languages and our knowledge, protected our water and our lives. And yet we see triple discrimination as women, as indigenous people, and people living in lands that were historically excluded and impoverished by the ambitions of the elite. Our voices continue to be marginalized and silenced by decision makers. Our bodies have been subjected to violence, and our children have been killed, leaving us in unbearable pain. Durban reminded us that racism is structural, and the 25 years that have gone by show that this racism not only continues intact, but it is also unpunished in our countries. When an Indigenous girl goes to ordinary justice to get protected against sexual violence and has and contamination by HIV, the prosecutor of Peru sidelines those prosecutors who are obliged to investigate the perpetrators. When Indigenous territories are invaded by the extractive industries without the state carrying out consultations or respecting our right to prior consent and our development model, that is structural racism, as is disclusion and delegitimization of our ancestral knowledge and the imposing of a single development model that destroys Mother Earth. That is also structural racism. So interculturality is a response for state action on the existing gaps in cultural diversity, on historical, political and social issues where negative visions persist of diversity that feed discrimination, inequality and racism, particularly affecting the indigenous peoples and Afro-Peruvians. Interculturality is, or should be, dialogue, shared learning and exchange based on recognition of cultural differences, and the intercultural approach is defined as adaptation of processes and services to geographical and environmental characteristics, as well as socio-economic, linguistic and cultural ones, with cultural practices, values and beliefs of the populations affected, with a value. It should value and incorporate the cosmic vision and development concepts of those peoples. We must emphasize the verbs adapt, value and incorporate, because in practice what they try to do is include us, which means assimilate us, and the indigenous peoples and women don't want to be assimilated. We call for the exercise of our right to self-determination, for respect of our own way of life. We don't want to be reduced to folklore and stereotypes, because the Republican states, which began their lives 200 years ago on our continent, continue to be colonial. And colonialism didn't end with independence. The policies of physical and cultural extermination continue with a systemic vulneration of the rights of the indigenous peoples and the Afro-Peruvians, with the gaps in gender, ethnicity and class in terms of exercise of rights. And this is our challenge. We must strengthen our organizations and link hands to uphold our cultural identities and demand guarantees of the exercise of our rights, organise and join forces to end colonialism and change the system, create good living and full life. Indigenous women and Afro-descendant women in Latin America have suffered multiple structural violence and been part of the struggles in our lands. Thus, the need to continue building strategies for resistance and strengthening the paths of healing that are so badly needed. Racism is an important part of colonialism. It wasn't overcome by independence because the Republican states were created without the indigenous peoples and indeed against them. Racism in our countries is structural and heavily linked to classism. That's why we talk about class racism. For indigenous women, the discrimination is triple. And there is no life free of violence without our ancestral lands. To protect indigenous women and guarantee our rights, we must guarantee the right to our lands, for our peoples and our way of life. And that is the only way that we can do this, through self-determination and indigenous autonomy. The gap. We must ensure that Durban goes beyond the laws. We need proper implementation. We must overcome colonial thinking. There are gaps between international standards and national law. This continues to be a major problem in our region. And yet we haven't come here as victims. We've come to bring the voice of the peoples and the indigenous women to tell you that we will continue to resist. We will continue to protect Mother Earth and all of the lives that depend on her. This is the heritage left to us by our ancestors, and we will leave this to our children. What we want is to achieve respect of our equal dignity. 25 years on from Durban, the indigenous peoples and women tell you that it's not enough to recognise that racism exists. We must combat it. Durban was a starting point. 25 years on, it needs also to be a turning point. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all members of the panel, Excellencies, distinguished participants. We will now proceed with the first segment of the list of speakers. All interventions from the floor are limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds. And this, as you are aware, is due to cost-saving measures that we have all agreed to. The list of speakers is now closed. And I next have the honor to give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa. His Excellency,
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, at this historic juncture of the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and the Programme of Action, we pay tribute to current and historical victims of racism and racial discrimination. In view of the persistence of this scourge, it remains pivotal that we assess progress in our collective efforts to combat it and rededicate ourselves to ensuring the full and effective implementation of the Durban Declaration and the Programme of Action Against Racism. The African Union theme for decades, namely justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations, remains our strategic rallying point for the realization of reparatory justice in this regard. We commend the African Union leadership for extending it from a year theme to a decade. We recognize the importance of the second international decade for peoples of African descent under the theme, The People of African Descent, Consideration, Justice and Development, and the need to galvanize global support to ensure the realization of reparatory justice. We are determined to unite in action to repair the gross human damage that was caused by colonialism, slavery, apartheid, slave trade, and the transatlantic slave trade, whose effects remain and whose pain and anger are still felt to date. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Ronald Lamola, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa. And next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal, Her Excellency Ms. Ana Isabel Xavier, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Portugal.
Thank you, President, distinguished Council, Excellencies. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honour to address this high-level panel to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. 25 years on from adoption, these instruments continue to be the most comprehensive global framework against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia and intolerance. Racism and racial discrimination by their very nature are not compatible with human dignity and equality. This anniversary is an opportunity to renew our collective efforts and transform commitments into action. For Portugal, combating racism and racial discrimination remain a national and international priority. Portugal remains strongly committed to full effective implementation of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. Thus, together with South Africa, Portugal facilitated the political declaration adopted at the 20th anniversary. In recent years, we've made important steps. Portugal adopted its first national plan of action to combat racism and discrimination. It created the Racism and Xenophobia Observatory. It carried out reform of the Commission on Equality and Against Racial Discrimination, making it independent, and it hosted the first in-person meeting of the anti-racism human rights defenders of the United Nations, contributing to coordination in the system and dissemination of good practice. And we know that the efforts must continue. There has to be ongoing coordinated action. You may always count on Portugal for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Festus Katuna Mbandeka, Attorney General of Namibia.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished delegates. The Durban Declaration and the Program of Action is a living and principled tool designed to tackle the enduring injustice of the past colonialism, apartheid, and inequality which still manifest in various ways across the world. As we mark the 25th anniversary of the near universal acceptance of the Durban Declaration, Namibia urges states to recommit to its principles. The slow progress in eliminating racism and racial discrimination worldwide requires universal action from all states. Mr. President, there is an urgent need to reinforce structural and socio-economic approach to implementing the Durban Declaration, and political leadership is the critical conduit for the elimination of the racist and discrimination stereotypes and practices. Concrete measures aimed at implementing the recommendations of the Durban Declaration must be alive to the ever-changing dynamics of society in combating of discrimination and racist practices online and offline. States have an obligation to ensure that tech developers and operators access human rights due diligence in the entire technology life cycle. The new and emerging technologies must be developed on principles of equality, merit-based assessment to avoid perpetuation of racial discrimination and racism in their use of operations. Furthermore, we underscore the importance of the role and technical assistance of the work of the Durban Declaration in the energy system, and they both contribute to the implementation of the Durban Declaration in different ways. Namibia remains committed to the full implementation of the Durban Declaration, and we maintain that prevention is the most effective way to eliminate racism and racial discrimination through collective interventions. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Princess Kasune, Minister of Justice of Zambia. Can we provide the mic for the Minister of Zambia? Okay, I request the Secretariat to verify. In the meantime, I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Juma Zuberi Homera, Minister for Constitutional and Legal Affairs of the United Republic of Tanzania.
Mr. President, Excellencies and distinguished delegates, Mr. President, the United Republic of Tanzania joined the others in commemorating the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and the Program of Action, which remains a vital framework in the global fight against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Mr. President, Tanzania's commitment to this cause is deeply rooted in its own history. As a frontline state in the struggle against apartheid and colonial domination in Southern Africa, Tanzania stood in solidarity with oppressed peoples in pursuit of dignity, equality, and self-determination. Mr. President, we believe that effort to combat discrimination must be pursued through inclusive and development-oriented approaches that address root causes and expand equitable access to opportunities for all. Tanzania embraces this same principle in its governance regime, as we are a diverse country with over 120 tribes and 400 dialects. We therefore underscore the importance of constructive international cooperation and a dialogue in ensuring the full and effective implementation of the Durban Programme of Action. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olivier Nduhungirehe, Minister des Affaires étrangères et de la Coopération internationale de Rwanda.
Excellencies, as we mark the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, Rwanda emphasizes the persistent threat posed by hate speech and impunity. Today, we witness how unchecked rhetoric, both offline and online, continues to fuel cycles of ethnic-based violence, particularly in the Great Lakes region, undermining social cohesion and regional stability. For instance, in the eastern DRC, Congolese Tutsi communities face ongoing threats, forced displacement, and attacks driven by inflammatory public discourse. Genocide and mass atrocity do not occur spontaneously. They follow deliberate stages, often preceded by systematic dehumanization through speech, which serve as early warning signs the international community cannot afford to ignore. The digital era has intensified these risks, allowing harmful narratives to spread rapidly across borders, undermining peace and stability. Rwanda calls for urgent, concrete action. First, the establishment of a cross-regional group of friends to foster cooperation in combating hate speech and impunity. Second, the strengthening of early warning and prevention mechanisms to address the evolving transnational and digital dimensions of incitement, including through engagement with digital platforms. Only through proactive measures can we protect vulnerable communities and honor the promise of Durban's vision for a world free of hate and mass violence, moving from commitment to action. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to Ms. Janine Melo dos Santos, Executive Secretary of the Ministry of Human Rights and Citizenship of Brazil.
25 years on from Durban, the Declaration and Programme of Action remain crucial frameworks to address racism. In affirming the legitimacy of affirmative action, Durban moved the global debate on formal equality towards substantive equality, changing lives and strengthening democracies. In the context of Durban, the qualified impact of the Black and other ethnic racial movements in Brazil were the result of the historic construction of collective political intelligence, decisive in driving deep-rooted institutional change, revolutionizing the right to education, increasing the presence of Black people within the state apparatus, including through the Racial Equality Statute and the law on quotas in the public service. Brazil and Colombia were crucial in they had a crucial role at the 54th General Assembly of the Organization of American States, negotiating a regional declaration on the rights of people of African descent, complementing the Inter-American Convention on Racism and the Plan of Action of the Decade of People of African Descent. There's also been recent progress in Brazil in terms of memory and reparations for slavery and transatlantic trade. We promoted recognition of places of memory of enslaved Africans in Brazil and actions against historic silencing and disproportionate violence against Black people, including the public figureheads of the Black movement, such as the Minister for Human Rights and Citizenship, Maka Evaristo, have transformed guidelines into policies that ensure access. Our affirmative action was born from true dialogue between the state and Black movements, bringing urgency to decision-making. This democratic innovation brought measurable results. We will continue to make progress with the same conviction. Racial equality is built on robust public policy, broad social participation, and political commitment. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Igor Sekreta, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus.
President, the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action were a milestone in international efforts on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia and related intolerance. Unfortunately, 25 years on, including because of the recent ignoring of these instruments by Western countries, racism, xenophobia and discrimination remain a reality for millions of people throughout the world, and armed conflicts feed these phenomena. Thus, in a number of countries of the West, there's been a rise in intolerance, racial segregation in education and in the labour force. Of particular concern is the rise of populism and parties that carry out Nazi ideologies and supremacy, not only on ethnic and linguistic grounds, but using state symbols. The Durban Declaration remains crucial to overcome colonial policy. The European powers for centuries used their colonies for raw materials, cultural values and a cheap workforce. The countries of Africa and Asia are still bleeding because of genocide. We support their countries' calls for reparations. To achieve the goals of the Durban Declaration, there must be political will. Belarus has always followed the goals and principles of the Durban Declaration, equality and fairness, and we will continue to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I have the honor now to give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Antonia Osvaldina Simão da Cruz Yaba, Secretary of State for Human Rights and Citizenship of Angola.
President, Angola supports the celebrations of the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration Programme of Action. This was a milestone. It continues to make the most comprehensive response by the international community in combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia and related intolerance, with a particular focus on people of African descent. For Angola, combating racism and racial discrimination are deep-rooted within our country's own history and its path as an independent nation. Angola reiterates its recognition of the principles of the Durban Declaration on the existence of a moral obligation in the international community to address the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and systemic racism. Ongoing dialogue, informed dialogue on appropriate and effective measures to repair historic injustices. This is crucial to promote justice, reconciliation, and equality. President, in conclusion, I reiterate that Angola will continue to support the full, effective, non-selective implementation of the Durban Declaration Programme of Action, reaffirming that combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance is a collective responsibility. It requires political will, international cooperation, and tangible action. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm pleased to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, distinguished panel, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union. The EU reaffirms its unwavering commitment to combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance in all its forms. As we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, we confirm our commitment and renew the call to its effective implementation. This work goes together with our resolute fight against anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Gypsyism, and all other forms of discrimination and intolerance. The EU recently adopted its new anti-racism strategy. In line with the DDPA, the strategy considers structural racism as a persistent denial of equal opportunities. It aims at countering this scourge. It recognizes the enduring legacy of Europe's global history, including colonialism and slavery, which have profound effects on societies today, underscoring the importance of education and historical knowledge to understand and address the roots of racism. The strategy confirms our support for ICERT and operationalizes many principles of the DDPA, the best way to celebrate its enduring relevance. The EU shares the view that a better organization of the work of the follow-up mechanisms of the DDPA 25 years after their creation could better allow to be more effective in supporting its implementation. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela on behalf of a group of countries.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. Venezuela has the honor of taking the floor to speak on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. As we commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, our group would like to reiterate its unwavering commitment to a joint and multilateral approach for a global struggle against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and all related forms of intolerance that constitute a direct violation and a denial of the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We categorically reject the resurgence of ideology based on superiority of one group over another, including fascism, Nazism, neo-Nazism, and all related expressions of them. Here we have an opportunity not only to think about the progress that has been made, but also to strengthen collective action in order to confront persistent and emerging challenges, such as the rise in hate speech and the unprecedented increase of other types of intolerance, such as the threat or the use of force against sovereign countries. The group of friends reiterates its commitment to the values of solidarity, respect, multiculturalism, and tolerance, while also promoting justice and human dignity as foundations for international peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya on behalf of the African Group.
President, Deputy High Commissioner Ms. Nada Al-Nashif, distinguished panelists, the African Group welcomes the holding of this important event as we witness a significant milestone in the struggle waged by the international community against the scourge of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. As we commemorate this historic milestone, we must remain cognizant of the spirit that led to the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which was in the response to the menace of the incidence of racism and discrimination and gross violation of human rights in the world. The African Group recognizes that over the past 25 years since the adoption of DDPA, notable progress has been made in the fight against racial discrimination at international, regional, national, and local levels. However, we acknowledge that serious gaps remain in eliminating racial discrimination in its forms and manifestation. We maintain that the persistence of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia, and related intolerance clearly demonstrate the need to look for new ways to address this problem with more resolve, with more humanity, and with greater efficiency. Accordingly, as we mark the 25th anniversary of the adoption of these international instruments, states must redouble efforts in galvanizing support for the full and effective implementation of the DDPA to give practical effect to the AU theme for the decade and the second international decade for the people of African descent. The 25th anniversary of the DDPA should serve as a clarion call for the international community on the urgent need to fully implement the provisions of this important instrument and scale up efforts to address the scourge of racism and racial discrimination in all their manifestations whenever and wherever they occur. Indeed, the Accra Proclamation on the reparation affirms that the fulfillment of reparation is a moral as well as legal imperative rooted in principles of justice, human rights, and human dignity, and that the claim for reparation represents a concrete step towards remedying historical wrongs and fostering healing among the people of African and people of African descent. In this regard, we welcome the adoption of by the African Union of its 39th Summit in Addis Ababa of the Algiers Declaration on the Colonial Crimes in Africa, which proclaimed 30th November as the African Day of Tribute to African martyrs and victims of the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and apartheid, and which further urges former colonial powers entirely to fully assume their historical responsibilities through the public explicit acknowledgement of the injustices committed. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bahamas on behalf of the Caribbean community.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of CARICOM member states in Geneva. As we mark the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration, we are reminded that racism is not a surface wound. It is a system that cuts deep. Its origins lie in the violent displacement of peoples, in slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and colonialism, and in the structures built to sustain those injustices. The Durban Declaration marked a pivotal moment in explicitly recognizing slavery and the transatlantic slave trade as crimes against humanity and affirming their lasting consequences. It called on the international community not merely to prune the visible branches of discrimination, but to confront its roots. For CARICOM, these legacies persist in economic disparities, social exclusion, and unequal access to opportunity affecting people of African descent, compounded in our region by the disproportionate impacts of climate change. This anniversary, following the 60th anniversary of ICERD and the proclamation of the Second International Declaration for People of African Descent, offers a vital opportunity to advance recognition, justice, and development. CARICOM is actively updating its 10-point plan for reparatory justice, and through the African-Caribbean Summit process is advancing practical measures to dismantle systemic racism. If we are serious about change, we must dig beneath the surface, address root causes, and invest in partnerships that allow affected communities not merely to survive, but to thrive. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, this year marks the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. China welcomes today's high-level panel convened by the HRC, which will help to renew our collective commitment to combating racism. Eliminating all forms of racism and ensuring equal dignity and rights for all reflects both the spirit of the UN Charter and the principles of fairness and justice. Yet, racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance remain widespread. The legacies of colonialism and the slave trade persist. People of African descent still face structural inequalities in education, employment, healthcare, and justice system. China has been a staunch supporter of the DPA and will continue to implement it. We will promote equal enjoyment of the result of development and of all human rights for people of African descent and work with the international community to advance the effective implementation of the DDPA and the Second International Decade for People of African Descent. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Thank you, Mr. President. Venezuela would like to join commemorations of the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration. Venezuela, as a multi-ethnic, pluricultural, and multiracial nation, reiterates its commitment to combating racism, racial discrimination, and related forms of intolerance. And we reiterate the need to continue to make progress in the full implementation of the Convention and the Durban Plan of Action, and particularly bring an end to any vestige of notion of superiority of certain cultures or races. Our constitutional principles enshrine the absolute respect of human dignity, equality, and non-discrimination, guaranteeing historical reparations and the fight against structural racism. We condemn the increased use of hate speech and actions against migrants and people of African descent, and we reject the ongoing neocolonial practice of hoisting unilateral coercive measures that have a negative impact on all sectors of society. Additionally, we denounce the military aggression experienced by the Venezuelan people on January 3, 2026, which led to the loss of life, harm to civilian infrastructure, and the kidnapping of President Nicolas Maduro and First Lady Deputy Celia Flores. This act of intolerance cannot be treated as normal by the international community, which is why we exhort energetic condemnation of the violation of international law and the United Nations Charter, and to defend peace and sovereignty of our peoples. Thank you.
Thank you. Distinguished participants, Excellencies, because in the list of speakers there was one speaker absent, so there was a move in the list of speaking order, and I've requested the Secretariat to inform delegation of such a move so they would also can anticipate accordingly. Excellencies, distinguished participants, I will now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. And I give the floor now to the representative of the International Service for Human Rights. You have the floor.
In the context of UN reform and the global crisis, it is more important than ever to respect, protect, and fulfill the agreements reached in Durban, renewing the commitments to accountability and justice, and opposing any reform that could represent a step backwards in terms of human rights and access to justice for those affected by systemic racism. The links between the past and contemporary forms of racism were clearly established in Durban. It was recognized at that moment that no country can claim to be free of racism. This demands that states move towards concrete measures in favor of racial justice and give greater priority to the global fight against racism and all its manifestations. ISHR echoes the words of HRDs and their organizations and call on states to 1. Oppose any UN reform that could potentially undermine access to justice and participation for Africans and Afro-descendants. 2. Actively participate in the development of the UN Draft Declaration on the promotion and respect of the human rights of people of African descent. 3. Renew all anti-racism mandates up for renewal this year. 4. Participate in the activities around the ACHPR Decade on Reparations. And 5. Recognize that systemic racism is a direct consequence of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and colonialism. Look at the root causes of systemic racism in each national context and take concrete actions towards reparations for historic injustices. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to Association de Défense et de Promotion des Droits de l'Homme. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. On this 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, we must reflect the ongoing struggles on the Ilam Tamils community under the Sri Lankan state control. Although the armed conflict ended in 2009, systemic discrimination persists. Tamil majority area remain heavily militarized with restriction on freedom of expression, assembly and movement. Land confiscation, displacement and unequal access to education, healthcare and economic opportunities continue to affect daily life. Cultural and linguistic rights are also under threat as historical sites and memorials are neglected or appropriated. Women and children are disproportionately impacted. The recent killing of a 17-year-old Tamil child, Albino Arul Pius, illustrates the ongoing vulnerability on this community. His murder is not an isolated incident, but a part of a broader context of structural impunity and targeted violence. Enforced disappearance and unresolved extrajudicial killings continue to fuel fear and insecurity. Survivors and families still face trauma with limited access to justice and reparation. The Durban Declaration calls for equality, dignity and accountability for the Ilam Tamils. This mandate remains urgent and unfulfilled. We urge the international community to continue monitoring the situation, support mechanisms for justice and reparation, and ensure that Sri Lanka upholds its human rights obligations. Only through sustained commitment to equality and non-discrimination can the Ilam Tamils community live with dignity, security and full participation in society. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to Rencontre Africaine pour la Défense des Droits de l'Homme.
Nous vous félicitons.
We would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, on your election. Racial discrimination today is condemned by all governments, and racial laws have been repealed by the majority of UN member states. CERD monitors the implementation of the International Convention. And in some cases, governments have been persuaded to take additional measures. Commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration shows the strong commitment of the international community to combat racism. To date, no country can claim to be racism-free, given that racism is a global concern. Fighting it must be a collective effort coming from true political resolve. For us, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action depends on solidarity and international cooperation. It is inspired by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and other relevant instruments. To conclude, we would like to know how to secure the gains we have had in the fight against racism in light of the international geopolitical situation where we see an increase of hostilities. Dr. Martin, what are the measures contemplated by your institution in order to assist countries drafting the necessary legislation?
I call on next the International Youth and Student Movement for the United Nations.
Monsieur le Président, je prends la parole au nom d'une ONG.
I take the floor on behalf of an NGO that played a leading role in the campaign for the UN decision to have in 2001 the Third World Conference Against Racism. Since Durban, we have been committed with all aspects of its follow-up in close collaboration with partner NGOs. The DDTPA is a historic milestone for the UN, recognizing that the modern world is built on the basis of slavery, transatlantic slave trade, and colonialism. We join the call for reparatory justice. However, we cannot ignore that the DDPA has been the victim of misinformation campaigns that distort its true content. As stated by the Council, the lack of public knowledge about the content of the DDPA represents a serious obstacle to its full implementation, which is why we strongly support the official theme of the Durban 25th anniversary, mobilizing global public support for the DDPA, and we invite panelists to reflect on this important point. Lastly, we would like to call on the OHCHR to implement fully and in good faith the resolutions of the GA and the Human Rights Council on a global outreach campaign for the DDPA and for reprinting it for wide dissemination. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I call on the representative for Global Action on Aging.
Mr. President, we welcome the holding of this important panel, which should function as a launching pad for a high-profile commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the DDPA and a strong mobilization for its implementation. It should be noted that the DDPA was adopted by consensus by the World Conference and that it was thereafter fully endorsed by the General Assembly in March 2002. We commend the Human Rights Council for its consensus support of the 25th anniversary and call on all UN member states to honor the DDPA through active participation in the forthcoming commemoration at the UN General Assembly. And in conclusion, without the global mobilization against apartheid, there would not have been a DDPA. In 2026, we are also commemorating 80 years of UN action against racism, initiated by the adoption of 2 resolutions at the very first session of the General Assembly in 1946. As stated in the Consensus General Assembly resolution proposed by an African country, elimination of racial discrimination is in the higher interest of humanity. We must not fail to act on this priority. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the representative of the United Nations Watch.
Mr. President, the measure of an event lies not in its aspirations, but in its legacy. 25 years ago in Durban, the UN convened a World Conference Against Racism, but this mission was betrayed. It was turned into a conference for racism. In the streets, thousands of radical activists marched against Israel and Jews, some carrying signs praising Adolf Hitler. Jewish students were threatened. The Arab Lawyers Union handed out cartoons of hook-nosed Jews. Copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the notorious anti-Semitic forgery, were openly sold. At the NGO forum, Israel was declared a racist apartheid state and accused of genocide. In the Durban outcome document, the Jewish state alone was singled out as a perpetrator of racism. Holocaust survivor and Congressman Tom Lantos called it, quote, the most sickening and unabashed display of hate for Jews he had witnessed since the Nazi era. Durban was a turning point. Anti-Semitism was repackaged in the language of human rights. Ancient libels were given new terms: apartheid, racism, genocide. Once embedded in UN discourse, that vocabulary spread to civil society, media, and campuses. The singling out of the world's only Jewish state as uniquely evil became normalized. Today, we live with the consequences. Jews are attacked in the streets of major cities, targeted in synagogues, harassed on campuses. And when a mandate holder of this council publicly amplifies rhetoric describing the Jewish state as the incarnation of evil and is backed by Iran and South Africa, we must ask, has the lesson of Durban truly been learned?
We have exhausted the first segment of the list of speakers. We will now proceed to the second segment of the list of speakers. And next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Mr. Chair, we would like to welcome the convening of this session, and we highlight the importance of the DDPA as the most comprehensive international framework to combat racism. Despite the progress achieved over the past decades, manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance continue to increase at an alarming rate, particularly against people of African descent, Arab Muslims. We note with deep concern the persistence of policies based on racial profiling, hate speech, and incitement, in addition to using religion as an aggravating factor in discrimination. We highlight the importance of countering such phenomena through the full implementation of the DPA, criminalization of all forms of racial discrimination, ensuring accountability, ending impunity, providing reparation, promoting societal education on the values of ICERD. Finally, the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories reflected the commitment of the international community to implement DTPA without conditions, especially in light of the practices faced by the Palestinian people. The full implementation of the DDPA is a legal and moral responsibility that calls upon us to end discrimination, provide reparation for the victims. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
شكرا. الكلمة الآن لإثيوبيا. شكرا سيدي الرئيس. نضم صوتنا إلى بيان المجموعة الأفريقية ونشكر المحاضرين على مساهماتهم القيمة.
It remains a landmark global framework in the fight against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Its adoption in 2001 was a recognition that the legacies of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid continue to shape inequalities within and among nations. 25 years on, its relevance is even more evident. Ethiopia attaches great importance to multilateral efforts aimed at addressing historical injustices and contemporary forms of racism. We underscore the complementarity between the DDPA and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and call for their full and effective implementation. Ethiopia believes that combating racism requires moving from rhetoric to reality through strengthened national institutions, inclusive development policies, and equitable access to education, justice, and economic opportunities. We also further stress the importance of the second international decade for people of African descent and ongoing efforts towards a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peoples of African Descent. In closing, Ethiopia reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the full implementation of the DDPA and calls upon all partners to renew political will and collective resolve to eradicate racism in all its forms and manifestations. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Mr. President, as we mark the 25th anniversary of the DPPA, we recall that Durban gave the international community a comprehensive, action-oriented blueprint to combat racism in all their forms and reaffirming equality and non-discrimination as core human rights principles. 25 years on, the DPPA remains as indispensable today as it was in 2001. It recognized that no country is free from the scourge of racism and that addressing it is a universal obligation. Since Durban, important normative and institutional advances have been made. The upcoming high-level meeting of the General Assembly on DPPA 25 and today's high-level panel open a unique window to convert this normative progress into sustained political action. At the same time, the evidence before this Council is sobering. Reports continue to deplore the persistence of systemic racism and structural discrimination. We are witnessing a sharp rise in hate speech, online and offline, targeting Africans and the people of African descent. Far-right ideologies, xenophobic popularism, and the weaponization of new technologies risk normalizing intolerance and eroding the advances made since Durban. These trends confirm that the promise of Durban is far from fulfilled. Delivering on these commitments is not optional, it is central to peaceful, inclusive, and cohesive societies. Kenya wishes to highlight 4 priorities for action. 1, we must renew political will at the highest level. 2, we must invest in implementation at the national level. 3, we must leverage partnerships across sections. And 4, we must place Africans and people of African descent at the center of decision-making. I thank you.
Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Monsieur le Président, la délégation algérienne.
Thank you. My delegation welcomes the holding of this panel celebrating the 25th anniversary of Durban, a universal reference in combating racism and related intolerance. A quarter century on, challenges remain and transform, particularly in terms of digital technologies. We reaffirm our commitment to this, and in 2020 adopted a law against hate speech and a prevention mechanism. We welcome the recent adoption by the European Union of the Declaration on the Colonial Past, which is a joint effort by African states to recognize neo-colonial crimes, apartheid, and the transatlantic trade. It establishes a dedicated day and calls on the colonial powers to assume their historical responsibility through a clear, explicit recognition of the injustices. There is an African platform to assess injustices and the relevant reparations. We stand in solidarity with people living under foreign occupation whose rights continue to be violated. I thank you.
Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malawi.
Mr. President, Malawi aligns with the statement of the African Group and thanks the esteemed panelists for the insightful discussions aimed at commemorating the significant milestones and galvanizing support for the full and effective implementation of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, DDPA. It is concerning to note that 25 years later, notwithstanding the adoption of the DDPA and the concerted efforts of the international community, many people around the world, including Africans and people of African descent, migrants, refugees, persons belonging to other racial, ethnic, linguistic, or religious minorities, continue to be confronted by racism, racial discrimination, hate speech, targeted violence, xenophobia, and other related intolerances. Malawi believes that the DDPA remains an essential ingredient for dismantling systematic racism and discrimination in all their manifestations, whenever and wherever they occur, and therefore we call upon all stakeholders to rise above mere rhetoric in order to effectively combat racism and all forms of intolerances. As we reflect on the lessons learned in the past 25 years, we affirm Malawi's commitment in taking all steps to implement the DDPA by enhancing awareness of the breadth and the scope of the DDPA and building on the constitutional provisions that prohibit all forms of discrimination and intolerance. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Togo. I call on the distinguished representative of Togo. The representative does not seem to be in place. Therefore, next I call on the distinguished representative of UNFPA.
Thank you, Mr. President. UNFPA welcomes this commemoration. After 25 years of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, the legacies of slavery and colonialism continue to shape inequalities in health, education, and economic opportunities. These injustices weigh disproportionately on women and girls of African descent. Data consistently shows that they experience higher rates of maternal mortality, gender-based violence, and unmet need for sexual and reproductive health services. Structural racism and sexism in health systems drive significantly higher maternal mortality, with examples by Black women in the Americas nearly dying 3 times more often. They also face heightened rates of adolescent pregnancy and limited access to contraception. UNFPA is conducting research on the impact of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs on people of African descent to promote inclusive and evidence-based dialogue in the framework of the UN Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. Moreover, a global symposium for bridging the gap in sex and reproductive health of African-descendant women and adolescents was held in Costa Rica in July 2025. This is part of a global coalition funded by Luxembourg, uniting governments, communities, health workers, and civil society to develop actionable strategies for closing maternal health gaps. UNFPA remains committed to promote the rights, dignity, and potential of people of African descent. I thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished participants. We have missed 2 speakers earlier, and therefore there's a prospect that speakers from the next list will move up. The Secretariat will advise you further. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Thank you. We're a multi-ethnic, pluricultural country with different groups and their own customs, which have enriched our country, including former slaves, Afro-Peruvians. We recognize their contribution and their struggle for freedom. This means that we must address the legacy of slavery and the racism that may still exist in our society. We are committed to fully implementing Durban. These are fundamental instruments for action on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. We have aligned our legislative and institutional framework to protect Afro-Peruvians, including constitutional reform to enshrine cultural diversity and identity. We have implemented a national policy to 2030 on Afro-Peruvians with equal access to services, participation, identity, and equal rights. Our state is attentive to calls from other groups such as the indigenous peoples within the national policy to 2030 on indigenous peoples, ensuring their rights, strengthening their participation and promoting full development of their cultural identity. Peru stands ready to participate constructively in activities to implement Durban. Thank you.
Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
President Sierra Leone aligns itself with the statements of the African Group and thanks the Deputy High Commissioner and the other panelists for their valuable contributions. This anniversary reminds us that the DDPA was and is a collective global response to racism and for addressing historical injustices in their modern forms. Despite progress at some levels, persistent inequalities demonstrated the necessity of transitioning from commitments to concrete implementation. Sierra Leone notes that combating racism requires a whole of society efforts involving governments, international organizations, and other stakeholders. To ensure effective monitoring, dialogue, and assistance to states, these efforts must be supported by adequately resourced human rights mechanisms. We emphasize the importance of the Second International Decade for People of African Descent and the ongoing negotiations towards a United Nations Declaration for promoting and protecting human rights of people of African descent. These processes complement the DDPA and strengthen global efforts to advance equality and dignity. Sierra Leone supports renewed global commitments, including the forthcoming General Assembly high-level meeting to mobilize political will and public support for the full implementation of the DDPA. May this anniversary marks a turning point from acknowledgement to transformation, equality, justice, and dignity for all. And I thank you, President.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, 25 years ago, the world adopted the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. It was a promise to dismantle racism and discrimination and to build a future of dignity and equality for all. As we mark this anniversary, we recognize that, despite the progress made, significant challenges, including systemic racism and rising hate speech, still persist across all regions. At home, Thailand's efforts to eradicate racial discrimination rest in our constitution, which guarantees equality before the law and prohibits discrimination in all its forms. Building on this foundation, Thailand is working towards the enactment of relevant draft legislation, including the Anti-Discrimination Act and the Gender Recognition Act, to translate principles into enforceable rights. The enactment of the Protection and Promotion of the Way of Life of Ethnic Groups Act also marks an important step for the rights of all ethnic groups. These efforts reflect the spirit of the DDPA. Combating racism and discrimination is a shared global responsibility. Thailand remains committed to working with all partners to ensure that commitments under the Durban framework are not merely reaffirmed, but translated into meaningful advancement and actions. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
سيد الرئيس أصحاب السعادة سيدات
Mr. Chair, Excellencies, good morning. On behalf of the Standing Independent Permanent Human Rights Commission of the OIC, I reaffirm our strong commitment to eliminating all forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance worldwide. The Commission underscores that Islamophobia has emerged as a contemporary form of racism affecting Muslim minorities in many parts of the world, undermining social cohesion and the equal enjoyment of human rights. At the same time, we still remain deeply concerned about the racist policies and practices by the Israeli occupation regime affecting Palestinians, particularly in Gaza and the OPT, which have resulted in grave violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. Addressing racism in a meaningful manner requires confronting such grave violations and eliminating double standards in the implementation of human rights. Our Islamic teachings promote equality, justice, tolerance, and respect for the dignity of all human beings. In this regard, interfaith dialogue, mutual understanding, and peaceful coexistence remain useful tools to counter racism and intolerance in all their forms. The Commission underscores the importance of partnerships among governments, civil society, media, and digital platforms to raise awareness, counter hate speech, and mobilize public support for anti-racism efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next will be Burkina Faso, to be followed by Côte d'Ivoire, Indonesia, and Belgium. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Burkina Faso.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, President. My delegation aligns with the statement by the African Group. We welcome the holding of this high-level panel and thank the panelists for their high-quality statements which shed light on the achievements of the efforts to combat racism and racial discrimination. This points to our common responsibility to eradicate these practices which are a denial of human dignity. Burkina Faso, with its cultural, religious, and community diversity, reaffirms its commitment to the full effective implementation of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action and underlines its complementarity with the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. My country is eagerly anticipating its interactive dialogue with the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination to review its 20th to 24th periodic report next April. In conclusion, we call for tangible, urgent action by the international community to address racism throughout the world. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Côte d'Ivoire.
President, Côte d'Ivoire aligns with the statement by the African Group. We welcome the holding of this high-level panel at this 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration of Programme of Action, which are the major frameworks for combating racism, xenophobia, and racial discrimination. Although there has been progress, my delegation regrets the unequal implementation of the recommendations from the DDPA, dependent on region and country, and persistent systemic racism, xenophobia, and intolerance, exacerbated by new technologies and social networks. Living in a world with these scourges means that the work of the international community has not yet been done. Côte d'Ivoire, in line with its commitment to implement the DDPA, has undertaken major constitutional, legislative and regulatory reforms to combat racism, xenophobia and intolerance. Amongst other measures, it has created the Supreme Authority on the Audiovisual Communication, which applies the law to combat racial hatred and racial hate speech in all media. We call on all stakeholders to show strong political will and undertake collective action to achieve consensus and combat racism and racial discrimination worldwide. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
President, Indonesia thanks all the panelists and reaffirms the enduring relevance of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action as we mark its 25th anniversary. While it remains a comprehensive framework to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, the persistence and evolution of these challenges highlight the urgent need to translate commitments into concrete actions. Indonesia underscores the effective implementation must be grounded in strengthened national frameworks, supported by inclusive policies, and encouraged by sustained efforts in education and public awareness to address prejudice at its roots. At the same time, emerging challenges such as rising hate speech and bias in digital technologies required forward-looking and inclusive responses. We recognize that addressing both contemporary manifestation and the enduring legacy of historical injustice remains essential to achieving equality and social cohesion. In this regard, we believe that enhanced international cooperation is key to accelerating progress. Mr. President, Indonesia wishes to ask the distinguished panelists what practical steps can states prioritize to effectively translate the DDPA commitments into tangible outcomes, especially after 25 years, particularly in addressing emerging challenges such as digital forms of discrimination. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. President. Belgium aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the panelists for their comprehensive presentations on the global fight against racism and the continued relevance of the DDPA. 25 years ago, Belgium played a constructive role in achieving a strong, inclusive and consensual commitment by all. The commitments enshrined in the DDPA remain as relevant today as they were at its adoption. Together with ICERT, the DDPA should continue to serve as a central framework and guiding thread for all discussions on the various dimensions of the global fight against racism. Much more work still lies ahead of this fight. We welcome the decision to launch a second international decade for people of African descent and are committed to ensuring that it generates tangible, positive impacts within our own country. Belgium strongly opposes all forms of racism, both abroad and at home, and is currently developing a new interfederal action plan to combat racism, discrimination and all forms of intolerance. Dear panelists, in your view, how can we best ensure that states come together, build bridges and inspire one another in advancing this common struggle while upholding the DDPA's key role? I thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished participants, I will now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. I now give the floor to the representatives of Promotion du Développement économique et social.
السيد الرئيس، بعد مرور 25 عاما على اعتماد إعلان وبرنامج
President, 25 years after Durban, the question before us is no longer one of recognition of racism, but its implementation. DDPA established an ambitious political framework to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. However, its full implementation depends on its systematic integration within the binding human rights framework. The experience that we gained through our cooperation with treaty bodies, special procedures, and follow-up mechanisms stress that robust tools exist. The challenge lies in ensuring coherence, coordination, and sustained follow-up. In order to implement recommendations, allow me to offer the following recommendations. The systemic integration of Durban commitment into state review processes, including alignment between the recommendations of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the UPR, and National Action Plans Against Racism. Strengthening data-driven approaches by developing clear and measurable indicators to assess progress in addressing structural racism, including its contemporary digital and intersectional dimensions. Given lack of inequality and hate speech in many settings, this anniversary, the President interrupts the speaker.
To the distinguished representative of Human Rights Watch.
Mr. President, the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action is a moment to celebrate, critically reflect and take stock. The DDPA provided a comprehensive blueprint for the combat of racial discrimination, including the recognition of its historic root causes. One significant achievement of the DDPA is the creation of opportunities for global discussions on reparations, including at the Human Rights Council. While significant disagreements persist, this discussion revealed that a failure to recognize the right to reparation for colonial atrocities will result in a continuation of injustices and a denial of rights that human rights frameworks, especially in Africa, provide to peoples dispossessed of their wealth, land, and natural resources. Civil society movements have been at the forefront of this struggle. Their tireless mobilization, despite persistent government pushback, put reparations on the international agenda. The African Union dedicated 2025 to reparatory justice for Africans and people of African descent. The EU then extended it to a decade on reparations and decided to join its efforts with Caribbean states and their communities who have spearheaded regional efforts to demand reparatory justice. That spirit of transnational connection should continue in close collaboration with civil society, especially affected communities, to ensure that reparations are community and human rights grounded. We therefore urge states to use this commemoration as an opportunity to make real progress on reparations to bolster the fight against systemic racism. Reparations are an important and necessary foundation for a just and equitable future. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the representative of Association Culturelle de Tamil en France.
Absent. So we move to the next one.
Absent. Okay, the representative doesn't seem to be here. I give the floor, therefore, to the representative of Rajasthan Samra Kalyan Sanstan by video.
Thank you, Mr. President. 25 years ago in Durban, the world made a solemn promise that racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance would no longer be tolerated as social realities. But confronted age grave human rights violation. The DPA remains the most comprehensive global blueprint to dismantle structural and systematic racism. Yet today, that promise remains understated. Data show that 1 in 3 people globally experience discrimination, while rising online and offline hate speech fueled violence and exclusion. Last year, in 2025, as we marked the 60th anniversary of the ICERD, now a state must move for commitment to compliance. We call for first concrete national action plans aligned with the Durban program backed by data, budgets, and accountability. Second, zero tolerance for hate speech and racist violence, consistent with international human rights law. Third, meaningful participation of victims, youth, and civil society in shaping solutions. Mr. President, Durban taught us a simple truth. Racism is not inevitable. It is constructed and therefore it can be dismantled. The choice before us is clear. Remembrance without action or justice with courage. Let us choose courage. We thank you. May all live happily.
Okay, thank you. We have exhausted the second segment of the list of speakers. So, Excellencies, distinguished participants, that was the last speaker we could accommodate. I wish to remind you that delegates inscribed on the list of speakers who could not take the floor due to time constraints can upload their segments to be posted on the extranet. I will now give the floor back to the panelists for their concluding remarks. Each of you would have 1 minute. And I start with Mr. Chungong, followed by, Mr. Martin Chungong, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have been very thrilled by the discussions that have taken place here today. And I just want to say that my takeaway is that Durban continues to be relevant and topical. There has been progress, as many speakers have said, but there is also, this is time for soul searching to see how we can rededicate ourselves to the fight against discrimination and racism. I come away, therefore, with the feeling of urgency on this matter because there are persisting and nagging challenges out there that we need to address. It is something that I take away with me, and I hope that I can continue to mobilize the parliamentary community to contribute to the ongoing implementation of the declaration and the program of action. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Next, Your Excellency, Ms. Beatriz Carrillo de los Reyes, please.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so very much. And I would like to conclude mainly by thanking all delegations for their contributions. You have all had something to contribute to this very enriching debate. Thank you. I'd like to finish with a message of hope, aspiration, of hard work, of strength, because over 25 years ago, let's think about where we were. All those that we are fighting for, where were they? And where are we now? Fighting for a better future. Diversity is a very important challenge in the 21st century, and we must face it head on. The Durban framework is more alive today than ever. We did not pick the time in which we live, but we do pick how we want to live out the time we were given. And here I would like to issue an appeal to all countries. Racism must come to an end. It must be uprooted from the streets, from the TV channels, from households, from public spaces. It must. Thank you.
Your Excellency, Mr. James Ndirangu, Waweru, please.
Mr. President, I thank the panelists, member states, and NGO delegations for their statement. It just goes to show advocacy and mobilizing of political will is our collective responsibility. Excuse me. The upcoming one-day high-level event on the sidelines of the UNGA 81 High-Level Week is a welcome initiative and should be a watershed moment to give and Ghana inject and mobilize strong political will, and I think, as was asked, political courage for the full and implementation of the DDPA and by adopting a succinct political declaration. Mr. President, in answer to my question, I would mark you all as good, but with room for improvement. And with this, I ask you to continue to support the work of the Intergovernmental Working Group as we negotiate the UN Declaration on the Human Rights of People of African Descent. I do thank you for this opportunity and honor. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to Ms. Ketty Marcelo Lopez. Madam.
Bueno, agradecerle.
I would also like to thank everyone, the delegations, for their contributions. But countries should also move from rhetoric to action and to consider things beyond cultural diversity in public policies. Oftentimes, indigenous peoples and people of African descent are simply seen as part of folklore. But in policies, they're not seen as rights holders. There will be no peace, no social justice, while indigenous peoples and people of African descent continue to be murdered. We need to decolonize the policies. Policies should not be colonial. They should be decolonized. Not just policies, though. We ourselves. The thoughts we harbor. The lives we live. Education is very important as well. Bilingual, intercultural education shouldn't be given only to people of African descent and indigenous peoples. All should benefit from such education. All should be familiar with our contribution and our wisdom as peoples. Thank you.
This brings us to the end of this high-level panel discussion. I wish to thank the Deputy High Commissioner who was with us, our distinguished panelists, and all the participants who have contributed to our discussion. We will take a short technical break before we continue with the high-level segment. Thank you.
Excelencias, distinguidos participantes.
Excellencies, dear participants, let's pursue our high-level segments in this panel. And it is my honor. Please, I ask you, take a seat. Let's be silent. It is my honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Sakon Prak, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Cambodia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, delegates, we have come together at a time where the international human rights system is going through trying times. Armed conflict, the geopolitical fragmentation, and the
they have.
Yes,
yeah.
do you mind?
It was okay. It was okay, but. Por favor, les ruego atención al orador.
Please, let's be silent. Listen to the speaker. Let's take a seat. Mr. President, dear delegates, we are coming together at a time where the international human rights system is going through trying times. Armed conflict, geopolitical fragmentation, and the rise of unilateral approaches weakens the mechanisms for the protection of populations. In many parts of the world, civilians continue to pay the highest price for political and military rivalries. Human rights cannot have long-lasting prosperity without peace, and development cannot prosper without security. In relations among states, the protection of human rights and dignity depend on strict respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and international law. Cambodia speaks with experience. Having come from decades of conflict, our country has found peace once again thanks to national reconciliation and a win-win policy started by Samdech Hun Sen. After 3 decades of stability, Cambodia has been able to achieve great things in the promotion and protection of human rights, favoring institutional reconstruction, economic strength, and progressive consolidation based on the law. This progress is specific, and we see it in the significant reduction of poverty, nearly universal access to elementary education, the improvement of health systems and social protection, increased participation of women in national and international organizations, and strengthening legal frameworks to combat domestic violence, trafficking in persons, and the protection of workers. We have development of civil and political life, legal reforms, while encouraging constructive dialogue with civil society. We continue our efforts to free Cambodia from the impact of mines by 2030, and we're assisting others in training for demining efforts. We step up our actions to combat transnational crimes, particularly online scams and human trafficking. Online scams are a worldwide problem that affects people beyond their borders. A national force created by our Prime Minister and its authorities have brought down several networks, saved thousands of victims, and arrested countless criminals. We are concluding a special law to combat online scams, which is part of our strong commitment to eradicate this crime. To meet such a challenge, Cambodia has taken on commitments with national, bilateral, and multilateral levels. This calls for cooperation, not simply police and military action, which can be used by mass acts of aggression and occupation. Dear delegates, as we secure our domestic achievements, Since mid-2025, Thai military operations have expanded in several border zones, having serious effects on civilian population with consequences that have direct relation to the responsibility of this Council. The second ceasefire reached at the end of last year is weak. Since then, military positions have been set up since beyond the established lines, moving in towards Cambodian territory. In several occupied border cities, civilians have been kicked out of their homes. Homes have been destroyed. Military infrastructure has been set up and access contained by barbed wire, preventing the safe, dignified return of civilians in violation of agreements between both countries. 650,000 people have been displaced. Over 80,000 people are unable to go back to their homes. These actions have an impact on the civilian population, and they raise serious concerns under international law and human rights, particularly the right to life, of personal safety, freedom of movement, to proper housing, and access to cultural and religious life. Throughout this period, Cambodia has shown the greatest level of responsibility and restraint by providing humanitarian assistance, guaranteeing continued provision of essential services to displaced persons, and remaining strongly committed to an efficient and long-lasting ceasefire and to a peaceful dialogue to find, once again, normalcy. The protection of human rights goes hand in hand with peace, and it is with that in mind that Cambodia is calling for the complete respect and the implementation of existing agreements, the withdrawal of Thai military forces from Cambodian territory. Their presence remains the main obstacle to the dignified, safe return of civilians to their homes, the peaceful settlement of differences in keeping to the principle of non-use of force, of international law and international humanitarian law. It would be only by doing this that these two peoples can coexist in peace, stability, and mutual respect. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And now, His Excellency, Her Excellency Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Slovenia.
Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, colleagues, 20 years after its establishment, the Human Rights Council remains a vital pillar of the multilateral system. It has advanced standards and responded to violations. Yet today, norms once taken for granted are openly challenged. Human rights do not erode overnight. They weaken each time we tolerate discrimination, justify impunity, or simply look away. Slovenia begins its third term with a clear conviction. Leadership on human rights must be principled, not selective, courageous, not convenient. Silence in the face of violations is not neutrality, it is complicity. Today we mark 4 years since Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine, a sustained assault on sovereignty, international law and human rights. This war is not only about territory, it is about whether force can override law. Slovenia reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Accountability for violations of international human rights and humanitarian law must remain central to this Council's work. Peace built on impunity is only a pause before the next atrocity. From Ukraine to Sudan, from Gaza to Myanmar, civilians continue to pay the highest price. Our credibility depends on confronting violations consistently, wherever they occur. The fragile ceasefire in Gaza must hold, and the humanitarian assistance must be increased to address the dire needs of the civilian population. We condemn, in the strongest terms, a series of recent Israeli decisions that introduced sweeping extensions to unlawful Israeli control over the West Bank. Such steps undermine international law and gravely diminish the prospects for a viable two-state solution. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to outline our priorities for the work in the Council. First, gender equality and the rights of women and girls. We are witnessing a coordinated global pushback against women's rights. Yet prevention of conflict requires inclusion. The Council was designed not only to react but prevent it. In Sudan, sexual and gender-based violence is used as a weapon of war. In Afghanistan, women and girls are being erased from public life, denied education, employment, and voice. This is not culture, it is persecution. The international community must not normalize it through fatigue or political convenience. As Mary Robinson,
وكما ذكرتنا ماري روبنسون، القيادة السياسية ليست مسألة محايدة فيما يتعلق بالبعد الجنساني. البعد الجنساني مرتبط بما إذا كان السلم سيدوم. بصفتي أول وزيرة خارجية في سلوفينيا أنا ملتزمة الدفع بالدور الريادي للمرأة في الدبلوماسية. نعم، آن الأوان أيضا لكي يكون لدينا أمينة عامة للأمم المتحدة. ثانيا، حقوق كبار السن.
Every society, yet protection gaps persist. Older women in particular face compounded discrimination. Dignity does not diminish with age. Slovenia stands ready to strengthen international standards in this area. Third, the right to clean, healthy and sustainable environment. Climate change and environmental degradation undermine the enjoyment of all human rights. They intensify instability and displacement. Environmental protection, gender equality and peace are inseparable and must guide policy at all levels. Excellencies, the real question before us is not whether the human rights system is under pressure. It is whether we are prepared to defend it when doing so is politically costly. Institutions do not fail because they are imperfect. They fail when we stop defending them. As discussions on UN reform advance, efficiency must not come at cost of universality. Chronic underfunding of the human rights pillar is not technical, it is political. Human rights are not a supporting element of the United Nations, they are its foundation. In this vein, Slovenia supports the Global Alliance for Human Rights and stands ready to engage in its activities. Colleagues, human rights are not self-executing. They survive only where they are defended. And today, defense requires courage. Slovenia stands ready to work with all partners to ensure that this Council remains a place where principle prevails over convenience and where rights are protected not only in words but in action. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And now, Her Excellency, Madame Therese Kayikwamba Wagner, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation, French language, and the Congolese diaspora of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Mr. President, High Commissioner for Human Rights, Excellencies, dear delegates, on behalf of the President of the Republic of Congo and the Prime Minister, allow me to congratulate you for this session. Mr. President, the DRC remains committed to the principles of the UN Charter and to the connected international instruments for human rights, which means that we have had reforms strengthening the rule of law and accountability. The protection of victims, particularly women and children, is a priority. We see this through a zero-tolerance policy against sexual offenses and conflict, and the implementation of a institutional process with reparations created by the law for the protection and reparation for victims. It created a fund in order to restore victims' dignity. Beyond the transitional justice, the DRC is also addressing the structural causes of the violation. The creation of economic and financial tribunals seeks to prosecute corruption and financial crimes that deprive the population of their fundamental rights. As regards the exploitation of strategic natural resources, my government is calling for the respect of international standards and the guiding principles of the United Nations on businesses and human rights. This state ensures that the whole value chain is protected. Mr. President, however, these efforts are hampered by violations that take place in the North Province and Kivu in occupied areas with the support of Rwanda. The report of the Group of Experts of the United Nations, the Fact-Finding Commission, and Resolution S/37/1 determined the severity of the violations and led to the creation of an independent inquiry commission. The Security Council in Resolution 2773 reiterated this and condemned serious violations, calling for an end to any support to the N23 AFC. Here there are murders, sexual violence used as a weapon of war, forced displacement, the enrollment of children, and pillaging of natural resources. A consolidated report of the government drafted with the participation of civil society reports over 17,000 serious attacks, over 50,000 loss of human lives, hundreds of kidnappings, the rape of at least one woman every 4 minutes, and nearly 8 million displaced persons. The government, for its part, has taken measures to preserve the legal order. In November 2025, a presidential decree rendered null and void the acts of the opposition forces. Authorities also continue their efforts in order to prevent and punish any hate speech. And legal inquiries are underway to prosecute this and other infractions related to the conflict, while respecting legal guarantees. In that regard, the Democratic Republic of Congo is cooperating with the Inquiry Commission to ensure that those responsible are prosecuted. The DRC fully takes on the protection of all its community. Allegations of hate speech or genocide ideologies do not reflect the policy nor the acts of the DRC. The protection of a community cannot be used as a foundation for a severe violation of international law, nor a legal occupation. The states responsible are submitted to must go before international instruments to have their concerns heard and not resort to violence. The challenges before are not merely financial. We see an erosion of multilateralism and the principles that underpin our international order. Budgetary restrictions are the consequences, not the cause. The human rights system goes hand in hand with peace and stability, and it should not be weakened. To weaken this protection mechanism is to jeopardize peace and our collective future. Given traditional and new challenges such as artificial intelligence and online violence, the High Commissioner needs means to the tune of its responsibilities. The execution of mandates entrusted to the Council is an indicator of our collective will. The Independent Inquiry Commission created by Resolution S37 is specific proof of this. Its operationalization will be essential if you want to preserve the integrity of the human rights system. Excellencies, to conclude, our experience in the DRC shows that without accountability there can be no justice nor long-lasting peace. Our commitment is part of a broader approach. Hope for an international order based on the rule of law, equality among states, and the effectiveness of accountability mechanisms. The credibility of the human rights system hinges on the implementation, on the enforcement of these principles for all without exception. It is only through this that it will be a pillar of peace and security. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. A continuación,
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Alessandra Locatelli, Minister for Disabilities of Italy.
Mr. Vice President,
Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is an honor to address this Council on behalf of the Italian government as Italy begins its new term as a full member. We are deeply grateful to all the states that supported Italy's election. This result is a source of great pride, but also a profound responsibility. Italy returns to this Council firmly convinced that it can be a point of reference and hub for dialogue, cooperation and concrete action, offering its experience and global vision. Italy promotes peace first and above all. In such a complex and geopolitically sensitive time, we are deeply convinced that pluralism and freedom of every person and the dignity of life must find new spaces for dialogue and become a real priority for all our countries. Italy opposes and condemns all forms of discrimination, racism, intolerance and violence, particularly against women. We have already implemented new laws and policies aimed at eliminating domestic violence, promoting respect and combating human trafficking. Italy will continue to firmly protect the rights of minors, the elderly and persons with disabilities. The protection of children and young people, especially in conflicts, humanitarian crises and emergencies, is a moral imperative, and we must join forces to ensure a dignified life for all. As Minister for Disabilities, I wish to reaffirm Italy's commitment to ensuring everyone's right to full participation in working, social, recreational, cultural, sporting and political life in our country. This is in line with the UN Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities, which this year celebrated its 20th anniversary, and with the measure disability reform underway in Italy, which places people at the center of policies and change perspectives to see the potential in each person and not their limitation, to invest and offer opportunities to ensure universal accessibility in every aspect of daily life and to leave no one behind. And the 2026 Paralympic Games, which are about to start in Milano Cortina, represent a strong and concrete sign of how the potential and the talents of every person can always emerge. But I hope that in future, despite the organizational divisions, we can get to a single open ceremony in which all our extraordinary athletes will parade together. Mr. Vice President, Italy will maintain its long-standing commitment to a universal moratorium on the death penalty as a crucial step toward its complete abolition. A distinctive feature of the Italian approach is our strong emphasis on dialogue, cooperation and technical assistance. We want to work to prevent violations before they occur. I thank High Commissioner Turk for his leadership and for his initiative to launch a global alliance for human rights. I look forward to further detail to support him and strengthen our partnership. We will also continue to cooperate fully with the special procedures, treaty bodies and the Universal Periodic Review. Mr. Vice President, dear all, the time has come to invest more in respect for human rights, in the great work we are carrying out together, so that peace, not hatred, guides people's actions. Peace, not hatred, guides people's actions. Human rights and security are inseparable. Respect for rights and freedom is the foundation of stability, while conflicts and violence erode them. Strengthening the international human rights system means investing in prevention, in concrete action that can no longer be put on the back burner. For this reason, Italy will work in this Council to build new bridges, promote dialogue between regions and traditions, and ensure that human rights remain at the center of the international agenda. We assume this mandate with humility, responsibility, but even with great determination, because together we can change the world. We can do more and more, and we can do it if we believe it together. Thank you.
La ringrazio.
Thank you. I now call on His Excellency Juraj Blanár, Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Slovakia.
Distinguished Vice President of the Human Rights Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It is an honor to be here in Geneva today for the 61st session of the Human Rights Council. First, let me thank the previous President, Ambassador Jörg Lauber of Switzerland, and I congratulate Ambassador Siddhartha Reza Subiri Dipuro of Indonesia on assuming the presidency of this body. In difficult times like this, you can count on Slovakia support in your efforts. Mr. Vice President, today we regretfully mark the 4th years of the war in Ukraine, a war that has brought immense suffering to the millions of civilians, destroyed critical infrastructure, and challenged the very foundations of the international order. Slovakia is also deeply concerned by the report of transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children, which raise serious legal and human rights concerns. We stress the importance of protecting children in armed conflict and support international efforts in this regard. In December 2025, Slovakia supported a UN resolution demanding the immediate, safe and unconditional return of all Ukrainian children who have been forcibly transferred or deported. Slovakia believes that achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine can only be achieved through a diplomatic solution based on the key principles of UN Charter, including the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized border. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not the only hotspot globally. In the Middle East, despite the formal ceasefire, the suffering in Gaza stands as a clear evidence of the urgent need for a renewed global commitment to peace and human rights. Restrictions of the basic human rights, administrative detentions without charges, or settler violence in the West Bank must stop. Almost 20,000 patients from the Gaza Strip, including 4,000 children, are awaiting treatment abroad. The escalations threaten the UN Security Council Resolution 2803, US President Trump's ceasefire plan, and the two-state solution that Slovakia supports. Slovakia is ready to cooperate with the international partners and continue the medevac transport of patients. We are also deeply concerned about the deteriorating situation of human rights in Iran, especially in the context of this year's events where the Iranian regime's security forces violently intervene against their citizens during the nationwide protests. Hundreds of people lost their lives. Slovakia supports joint international condemnation of the brutal crackdown on protest, and so our expression of solidarity with the Iranians demanding dignity, better life and fundamental freedoms. Therefore, Slovakia welcomed the January emergency session of the UN Human Rights Council and the adoption of the resolution in the context of the suppression of nationwide protest that began on December 28, 2025, including the decision to extend the international fact-finding mission on Iran. With regret to Venezuela, Slovakia recalled very clearly that the principles of the international law and the UN Charter must be upheld under all circumstances. Slovakia, in cooperation with its partner in the EU and in the region, will continue to support genuine dialogue and the democratic transition in Venezuela. This hope and expectation are also fully in the spirit of principles and commitments guiding the relationship between the EU and the CELAC region, as included in the joint declaration from Santa Maria, Colombia in November last year. Mr. Vice President, allow me also to touch upon the topic whose significance is on the increase and requires the attention on Human Rights Council as well. Since my speech delivered at this forum last year, new technologies, including artificial intelligence, raised and serious questions about their correlations with the human rights. Moreover, it is necessary to ensure equal access to the benefit of AI for all, including smaller states, independent researchers, and emerging innovators. Slovakia is devoted to supporting balanced development of new technologies and continuous growth of human capabilities, which was confirmed at the capital of Slovakia, Bratislava AI Forum in November last year, supported by the representatives of United Nations, the OECD, and UNESCO. We call upon the responsible development and use of artificial intelligence technologies by states and other actors. It is a challenge for whole human civilization. The future of artificial intelligence remains in our collective hands. Mr. Vice President, in conclusion, let me congratulate the Human Rights Council on its 20 years of existence. Its anniversary is an opportunity to acknowledge and prize its achievements, but at the same time reflect on its shortcomings. We fully support the current rationalization effort, highlight the need for a more efficient and responsible Council, taking into consideration the current financial crisis, but also ongoing UN80 reform. Protection of human rights should be our main common goal, and with such a vision, Slovakia is running its candidacy for the UN Security Council for 2028 and 29. We believe that protecting human rights is the best way for the Security Council to achieve its mandate of maintaining international peace and security. I thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias. A continuación.
Thank you. The Council will now be addressed by His Excellency Mr. Osman Saleh Mohammed, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Eritrea, by video message.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is an honor to address this Council at the opening of its 61st session. Since my last address to this body, the global landscape continues to undergo through extraordinary changes. While the multilateral system has faced challenges before, we must acknowledge that it is now under unprecedented strain, where the sovereignty and territorial integrity of nations is violated, wars are waged in blatant violation of the prohibition of the threat or use of force. The international community has fallen short of its collective commitment and purposes and principles contained in the United Nations Charter. The United Nations is not fully living up to the mandate entrusted to it. This reality cannot be attributed to the current liquidity crisis confronting the organization. It also compels us to reflect critically on the structural and political dynamics that have shaped the functioning of the system over time. Mr. President, the Human Rights Council bears a distinct and significant responsibility for promoting universal respect for the protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms, yet it must be acknowledged with sincerity that the Council has not consistently fulfilled this responsibility. At times, its work has been diverted to serve narrow political interests rather than the universal principles it was established to uphold. This trajectory must be reversed. At the same time, there exists a genuine will among states to address issues that directly affect the lives and livelihoods of these peoples. In a recent nationally broadcast interview, President Isaias Afwerki stated, I quote, "The universal aspiration of the peoples of the world is clear: to live in peace and dignity, to benefit fairly from their labor, and support one another in solidarity." Unquote. This aspiration should guide our collective work. Absent such a shared commitment, we cannot claim to be advancing the human rights of all peoples. The very existence of Eritrea is rooted in the aspiration of its people to chart their own future, free from external intervention, and shoulder the responsibility of nation building in pursuit of an equitable society. The sacrifices made by the Eritrean people to reach this point are profound and enduring. They continue to inspire our resilience and determination in the face of adversity since the attainment of our independence. Mr. President, Eritrea's vision is clear. We remain firmly committed to building a prosperous and self-reliant nation in which fundamental rights and freedom, including the right to development, are promoted, protected, and respected. In conclusion, Eritrea reaffirms with unwavering conviction its commitment to constructive engagement with this Council and its members, with the aim of fostering long-term genuine partnership in the spirit of mutual respect for sovereignty and development. We stand ready to contribute in good faith in the work of this Council to promote international cooperation and to work collectively towards the shared ideals of peace, justice, and the inherent dignity of all human beings. I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias.
Thank you. I now call on His Excellency Mr. Espen Barth Eide, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway. You have the floor, sir.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights emerged from the ashes of two world wars from the experience of the interwar years, from the Great Depression, from the rise of nationalism, of fascism, of Nazism, and eventually the Holocaust and other genocides. The people who wrote them down as part of the post-Second World War foundation of this United Nations were not naive idealists. They were acutely aware of how bad it can get, and they've just seen the worst drama in mankind through these two world wars, and that's exactly why they set up the principles as they did. At the heart of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights lies a transformative conviction that human rights and human dignity is universal. Every person has equal and inherent rights that no government can take away. And it's important to understand and to remember 80 years on that there was an intrinsic, holistic triumvirate between peace and security, the prohibition against the use of force but in self-defense, the promotion of human rights in all countries, and the agreement that we should cooperate economically and otherwise for shared development and shared economic progress. They are not only three pillars, they are three pillars of the system, but they're also mutually constituting. We know that when wars are raging, we also see human rights violation. On the other hand, if human rights are respected, there are less wars and less conflicts. They are mutually constituted and they have to be understood together. In many of the wars of today, and I could mention many, but let me mention Ukraine, because it's the fourth year since the full-scale invasion and we're almost at 12 years since Crimea, we're seeing both a blatant violation of the prohibition against the use of force against another country. The most principal rule of international cooperation is that thou shalt not invade, occupy, and take over the country of other states. This is the foundation for how we can cooperate. But we also see a whole series of violations of human rights in the occupied areas, for instance, and in the kidnapping of children, and in all the other transgressions that the Russian Federation stands behind. And there are many examples. So it's a very important moment to remember what our founders wanted to tell us, that these things are deeply involved. And I say that at a time where we're seeing that human rights are challenged, not only by authoritarian states, but also in states that traditionally were seen as closer to the champions of human rights. This is something we have to take seriously, because human rights, peace and security and development still must be the pillars. We should reform the United Nations. We should be better at solving the issues at hand, but there is no reason to move away from these core intrinsic pillars and principles. We need to stand up for them across the board. And ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I'm pleased to announce Norway's candidacy for the Human Rights Council for the period 2028 to 2030. Our candidacy reflects our long-standing role as a principled supporter of international law, a consistent supporter of the UN's work to protect and promote human rights globally. We believe that these rights apply to all people, in all places, all the time. And if we only refer to them when it suits us, it becomes a menu from which we choose, but it's not a menu, it's an obligation to all. Norway stands firmly for the rights of women and girls, for gender equality and equality in all its aspects. We remain a strong force for freedom of religion and belief, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and we will continue to support human rights defenders and civil society. This work and their work is essential for accountability and democratic resilience. In this session, Norway will lead the mandate renewal on human rights defenders. Our message is clear: those who stand up for the rights of others needs special protection. Norway will continue to support independent investigations into serious human rights situations. Accountability must apply everywhere, regardless of geography or political alignment. Nobody should be beyond scrutiny when fundamental rights are violated. And we will work with all partners to search and reach common ground. The Human Rights Council is at its strongest when it builds bridges and focuses on its core mandate. I would also like to say that technological change is reshaping the human rights landscape, and we need to take that seriously. Artificial intelligence, emergent technologies will be integral aspects of every part of our life. And we need to understand the need to develop these technologies as forces for good, in the interest of development, in the interests of equity and equality, and the interest of a level playing field, in line with international human rights and international law. Used responsibly, this can be a good force for mankind. If not, we have a serious problem. This requires safeguarding privacy, countering discriminatory algorithms, protecting children online, and reducing the global divide. The authority of this Council rests on our shared commitment to universal rights, fundamental freedoms, and the inherent values of every human being. When these principles are challenged, our response must be clear and consistent. If they are challenged more, we must be more consistent and stand up for the rules. And let me also say from my own experience as a Norwegian how our country moved from poverty to a modern, efficient, democratic welfare state. It was incredibly important to understand that you need both the political and civil rights and the economic and social rights. Again, they are mutually constituted. You can't do one and then the other. It is because people were standing up for the rights of the many that we got the economic and political and social rights we have today. So the freedom of organization, freedom of speech is also inherently important to get to the promotion of the economic and social rights that we also so much cherish. So this is our position, this is what we believe in, and we are hereby, as I mentioned, announcing our candidacy for the election to the Council 2028 to 2030, and I look forward to your cooperation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
I thank you. And I call upon His Excellency Mr. Youssef Raji, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigrants with the Republic of Lebanon.
السيد نائب الرئيس.
Vice President, at the outset, allow me to congratulate you on acceding to the presidency of the Council. Lebanon will support you in your efforts to ensure the effectiveness of the Council's work. We thank the Office of the High Commissioner for preparing the session and extend greetings to Mr. Volker Turk, who has shown to be one of the strongest defenders of human dignity and core principles. We decided to participate in this high-level segment as a sign of our conviction that with the challenges in today's world, we must show in words and in action our absolute support to the United Nations system, and the Council is a pillar of that system and of human rights, in line with the approach that my government has adopted, which is based on reform and on promoting democracy and the rule of law, combating corruption, and liberating territories with disarmament and limitations on possession of arms, including within the official forces, the reform of institutions, and the promotion of the economy in order to return to prosperity. We have financial, economic, and legal reforms which are wide-ranging. We have restructured the banking sector. There is a law on the independence of the judiciary. These reforms can only work if we are truly committed to promoting and protecting human rights, particularly to the empowerment of women, the protection of vulnerable groups, as well as guaranteeing fundamental freedoms and the independence of the judiciary. we do this despite the various challenges. We will overcome the challenges through political will and openness within civil society, working with the various international human rights mechanisms. In Lebanon last month, our government's readiness to address commitments was shown. In order that the government's efforts may meet expectations, we need the following, and I call on states. There must be pressure on Israel for it to stop violating Lebanese sovereignty. It must withdraw from the occupied territories, free the prisoners in line with the relevant resolution and the ceasefire agreement of 2024. There must be support to Lebanon's army. Its capacities must be strengthened in order to reduce the number of weapons in the hands of non-government actors, and control of Lebanese territory must be assured. We point to the conference on support to the Lebanese army to be held in Paris next month. We have supported Syrian refugees during the crisis. This has been an obstacle to economic recovery. Multilateralism must be reformed in order to reach a new balance in this complex world. And there must be reforms. Multilateralism must not be eroded. We see this with increasing concerns. It is a great threat to the international human rights system, leading to a multiplication of crises and human rights abuses, as well as abuses of international humanitarian law. The erosion of multilateralism also undermines financing of the United Nations system and international bodies, as well as the international courts, with a negative impact on prevention and on the protection of human rights throughout the world. This erosion also brings polarization on human rights to the detriment of universalization, individuality, and interdependence. Finally, if there is no robust multilateralism, we cannot guarantee human rights in a world facing enormous emerging crises, including climatic, digital, financial, environmental, and we must act together to ensure that we have a solid international human rights system that can stabilize international relations. Lebanon stands ready to contribute to the collective effort. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Excelencias, queridos colegas, este ha sido el último.
Excellencies, this was the last speaker that we could accommodate this morning. We will reconvene this afternoon at 14:30 to continue with high-level segments. I hereby close the fourth meeting of the 61st session of the Human Rights Council.